In 2023, Mount Everest witnessed its deadliest year ever, with 17 lives lost in a single season. Many believe years of elite training are essential to conquer its peak. Yet today, anyone with sufficient funds can acquire a permit and attempt the ascent. This accessibility has paved the way for a terrifying trend. Individuals with minimal experience unknowingly step into a fatal trap. Why would someone risk everything for a photograph on the world's highest mountain? We delve into the stories of 3 inexperienced climbers who defied every warning and met their end on Everest. Shreya Chaklorphine was a 33-year-old woman whose dream far outstripped her actual skills. Born in Kathmandu, Nepal, Shreya grew up with Mount Everest ever present on the horizon. When she was just 9 years old, her father took her on a helicopter ride to see the peak from the air. Her parents told her that reaching the top on foot was incredibly difficult, and that simple sentence planted a seed in her mind that would grow for the rest of her life. Later, she moved to Mumbai and eventually settled in Toronto, Canada, where she worked as a fashion buyer for a clothing chain and started her own business, SOS, Splash of Style Incorporated. But even while living a busy life in a flat city, the mountain called to her. She became determined to be the first South Asian woman from Canada to stand on the summit. To make this dream a reality, Shreya and her husband Bruce made a massive sacrifice. They took out a second mortgage on their home, spending nearly $100,000 on the expedition. This was a life-changing amount of money, and when you invest that much, you feel an immense pressure to succeed. You feel as though you cannot return home and admit failure. This mental state is known as summit fever, where reaching the top becomes more important than staying alive. Her training, however, did not align with the magnitude of the challenge. How did she prepare for the highest mountain on Earth? She didn't climb smaller peaks or spend months in freezing conditions. Instead, she walked around her neighborhood in Toronto, specifically the hills near Dufferin Street and Eglinton Avenue. She wore a heavy 20 kilograms backpack and walked 19 kilometers every single day, while she also engaged in some karate, rock climbing, and cardio workouts. She had almost no real mountaineering experience before she left for Nepal in 2012. Upon her arrival at base camp, red flags immediately began to appear. She had booked her climb with a company called Utmost Adventure Trekking, a new startup that had never successfully guided anyone to the summit of Everest before. They were cheaper than the renowned companies, but lacked the expert knowledge needed to keep a beginner alive. During her training at the Khumbu Icefall, Shreya had to be taught how to put on her crampons, the metal spikes worn on boots for walking on ice. This is a basic skill that most climbers master years before even considering Everest. The senior Sherpa on her team was so concerned about her slow pace that he reportedly refused to take her any higher than base camp. He could see she lacked the necessary strength, yet the company did not stop her. They allowed her to continue with 2 less experienced Sherpa guides. On the 18th of May 2012, Shreya began her final push to the summit from Camp 4. Most fit climbers can complete the round trip from this camp to the top in about 13 hours. It took Shreya 19 hours just to ascend. The mountain was incredibly crowded that day, and she got stuck in a massive traffic jam at the Hillary Step. Over 150 people were rushing to utilize a brief window of good weather, and the rocky path could only be traversed one person at a time. She stood in the freezing air for hours, waiting her turn. While she waited, she was breathing through her supplemental oxygen bottles, consuming her life support before she even reached the summit. On her way up, she encountered the owner of her trekking company, Ganesh Thakuri, who was descending. He saw how weak she was and implored her to turn around, telling her she had been in the death zone too long. Shreya brushed him off, stating, "I am going to the top. There is no way I am going back." In a decision that many experts later criticized, Thackeray gave her his own last bottle of oxygen so she could continue. Shreya finally reached the summit at 2:20 p.m. on May 19. This is dangerously late in the day. Most climbers aim to be heading down by 11 a.m. because the weather can change in an instant. Despite being exhausted and low on oxygen, she spent 25 minutes on the peak celebrating her achievement. She was the first South Asian woman from Canada to reach the top, but the victory was about to turn into a tragedy. As soon as she began her descent, her body failed. She was walking so slowly that she could barely stand, and her speech became slurred. Her attention began to wander, a clear sign that her brain was not receiving enough oxygen. She was on her 9th bottle of oxygen, and it eventually ran out completely. Her Sherpas tried to help her by pushing and pulling her down the mountain toward an area called the balcony. They were practically carrying her. The temperature dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, and the wind began to scream at 129 kilometers per hour. Shreya could no longer move her legs. As the sun went down, she collapsed in the snow. Her last words to her guides were a heartbreaking plea: "Save me." She died that night at 10 p.m., having been climbing for 27 hours straight. Her Sherpas had to leave her there because they were also running out of oxygen and would have died if they had stayed. What happened after her death was just as tragic. Because she died so high up, her body remained on the mountain for 10 days. Other climbers had to walk right past her frozen body to reach the summit. One climber, Leanne Shuttleworth, recalled having to unclip her safety rope and move around Shreya's body just hours after she died. Shreya was still clipped to the main climbing line, sitting in the snow in her bright red parka. Back in Toronto, her husband Bruce was woken up at 5:30 a.m. by a phone call. At first, the news was good. They told him she had reached the top. He began celebrating with her friends, but a few hours later, the second call came, informing him she was gone. Bruce later said he was shocked the guides ever let her go that high if they knew she was struggling. A team of 5 Sherpas eventually had to go back up into the death zone to retrieve her. They slogged through terrible weather for 2 days to bring her body down to Camp 2, where a helicopter could finally reach her. Her body was flown to Kathmandu, where she was cremated at a Hindu temple while her family watched. Her story sparked a huge debate in Canada and Nepal about why people with no experience are allowed to pay their way onto such a deadly mountain. But Shreya wasn't the only person who thought they could conquer the mountain with nothing but willpower. In 2023, the world's highest peak claimed more lives than any other year in history. Among them was a 9-year-old teacher from India. Suzanne Leopoldina Jesus was from the state of Maharashtra, and she had a very specific historic mission. She wanted to become the first Asian woman with a pacemaker to scale Mount Everest. A pacemaker is a small device placed in the chest to help control the heartbeat. Suzanne had trekked to base camp in 2022 and felt she was ready for the peak, but she was about to find out that the upper slopes are an entirely different world. Suzanne's attempt was troubled from the very start of her training in March 2023. To prepare for the summit, climbers must undergo acclimatization exercises to see how their bodies handle the thin air. One common exercise involves walking from base camp to a nearby location called Crampon Point. This is a very short distance of only 250 meters. For a fit climber, this walk takes between 15 and 20 minutes. Suzanne's performance during these exercises was a clear warning of the danger to come. On her first attempt, it took her 5 hours to walk those 250 meters. On her second attempt, it took 6 hours. By her third attempt, it took her a staggering 12 hours to finish a 20-minute walk. It wasn't just her speed that was failing. Suzanne was also suffering from a severe throat issue that made it nearly impossible for her to swallow food. If a climber cannot eat, they cannot get the energy their muscles need to survive the extreme cold. Her guiding company, Glacier Himalayan Trek, and the government officers of Nepal saw the disaster coming. They warned Suzanne 5 days before she died that she was not qualified to go any higher. They told her to abandon the climb and leave the mountain for her own safety. But Suzanne refused to go. She argued that she had already paid her permit fees, which can cost up to $15,000, and she insisted that she had to reach the top to set her world record. The situation on the mountain quickly turned from a difficult climb into a very tense and public fight. She went on Facebook to express her feelings to the world. In a shocking post, she claimed the Sherpas she hired were torturing her with misadventure just to make her quit her mission. She felt they were being mean and trying to ruin her record. But while Suzanne was typing on her phone, the Sherpas were looking at a woman who could barely breathe. They even posted a video showing her completely out of breath before she had even started the real climbing. On Everest, being that tired at base camp is a clear sign that you will likely die if you go any higher. Eventually, Suzanne's painful throat issue worsened. If you can't eat, your muscles have no fuel. Without food, your body starts to break itself down just to keep your heart beating. You might also wonder if her pacemaker played a role in what happened. A pacemaker is a wonderful tool that helps a heartbeat in a steady rhythm. However, even the best pacemaker cannot fix the biggest problem on Everest, the lack of oxygen. At high altitudes, there is only 1/3 of the oxygen we breathe at sea level. Your heart has to work 3 times as hard just to keep you alive. For Suzanne, her heart was already struggling, and the thin air was putting a massive strain on it that her pacemaker couldn't alleviate. Her heart was trying to pump blood that simply didn't have enough oxygen to keep her organs working. For 6 days, Suzanne sat at base camp, growing sicker and sicker. Her guiding company and government officers begged her to leave for 5 days straight. But because she wouldn't go, the situation became a legal emergency. The police and government liaison officers had to be called to her tent. They decided they had to remove her by force because she was no longer thinking clearly. On Everest, when your brain doesn't get enough oxygen, you can't always make safe decisions for yourself. On the evening of the 17th of May, 2023, Suzanne was forcibly put onto a helicopter and flown from base camp to a hospital in the town of Lukla. She had only managed to reach an altitude of 5,800 meters, which is only about 450 meters higher than base camp. It was a tiny distance, but for her, it was a fatal journey. Sadly, Suzanne passed away the next morning at 5:13 a.m. while doctors were trying to treat her in the hospital. She died from a combination of extreme exhaustion and high-altitude illness. When you are that tired and haven't eaten for days in thin air, your organs eventually just stop working. Her body simply could not handle the stress any longer. No amount of money or determination can make a body do something it isn't physically prepared for. Suzanne's story happened in a world of modern helicopters and hospitals. But almost 90 years ago, one man tried to climb Everest with almost no gear, no oxygen, and a plan that seemed like it came from a dream. Have you ever wondered if someone could climb the world's tallest peak with nothing but faith? Most people spend years training and thousands of dollars on the best gear to survive Mount Everest. But in 1934, a man named Maurice Wilson decided he would do what no one else could. He didn't have a team of experts. He didn't have oxygen tanks. He didn't even have a fully working pair of arms. Maurice was a British soldier who had fought in the terrible trenches of World War I. He was a very brave man who won a medal called the Military Cross for his courage in battle. But the war left him with deep physical and emotional scars. He had been badly wounded by machine gun fire, and his left arm was largely immobilized, causing him sharp pain for the rest of his life. After the war ended, he couldn't find peace. He wandered from country to country, leaving jobs and relationships behind because he felt like he was chasing a ghost. Then, something happened that changed his life forever. Maurice became very sick with tuberculosis, a disease that attacks the lungs. He claimed that he met a mysterious man in London who told him that he could heal himself through prayer and fasting. Maurice stopped eating for weeks and prayed every day. When he got better, he became convinced that these spiritual tools were more powerful than any science or doctor. He decided that he had a divine calling to climb Mount Everest alone to prove to the world that faith could overcome any physical limit. But how do you climb a mountain when you have never even stepped on a glacier? Wilson's plan was so wild that his friends thought he was losing his mind. He didn't want to just walk to the mountain. He decided he would fly a small second-hand airplane all the way from England to Everest. He named his plane Everest. His plan was to fly into Tibet, crash-land the plane high on the side of the mountain at about 4,267 meters, and then just step out and walk to the top. The biggest problem was that he wasn't a pilot, and he had never climbed a mountain in his life. He bought a gypsy moth biplane, which is a tiny plane made of wood and fabric. He took flying lessons, but he was a very slow learner. In fact, it took him twice the normal time just to get a pilot's license. Before he even left for his trip, he crashed his plane into a hedge in England during a test flight. The government was so worried that they banned him from flying to Everest, but Maurice didn't care about rules. Despite the ban, Maurice took off illegally on the 21st of May, 1933. His flight was a series of miracles that didn't make any sense. He didn't have proper maps for the desert, so he used a children's atlas to find his way. Think about that. He was flying a plane over thousands of kilometers using a book meant for school kids. When he finally got across India, the authorities were done playing games. They took his plane away and impounded it so he couldn't fly over Nepal. But Maurice Wilson was not a man who gave up easily. He spent the entire winter in a town called Darjeeling, where he fasted and planned his next move. While he was there, he met 3 Sherpas, Taiwan, Renzing, and Zaring, who had worked on previous Everest expeditions. They were impressed by his spirit and agreed to help him. But there was one more problem. Tibet was a forbidden country, and foreigners weren't allowed to enter. In March 1934, they came up with a clever trick. They all put on disguises and dressed as Buddhist monks so they could sneak across the border illegally. Maurice even pretended to be deaf, mute, and very sick so he wouldn't have to talk to anyone who might get suspicious. They carried their gear in secret boxes. They even hid a compass inside a prayer wheel and a thermometer inside a monk's staff. They trekked for hundreds of kilometers through the frozen mountains until they reached the Rungbuk Monastery at the very foot of Everest. Maurice stayed at the monastery for only 2 days before heading out onto the mountain alone. He didn't have the right boots or an ice axe. He even found a pair of crampons, the metal spikes for walking on ice, that a previous team had left behind. But do you know what he did? He threw them away because he didn't understand how to use them. His first attempt was a total disaster. Maurice didn't understand how glaciers worked. He saw great ice towers that looked like giants, and he got lost among them for days. He didn't know how to cross the deep cracks in the ice called crevasses. After 5 days of fighting a freezing blizzard, he was exhausted and had a badly twisted ankle. He was also suffering from snow blindness, which happens when the sun's reflection off the snow burns your eyes so badly you can't see. He managed to crawl back to the monastery, where he stayed in bed for 18 days to recover. He wrote in his diary, "It's the weather that's beaten me. What damn bad luck." Most people would have gone home, but Maurice believed that the bad luck was just a test of his faith. On May 12, he went back out for a second try. This time, his Sherpas helped him reach a higher camp near the bottom of a giant ice wall called the North Col. They found some leftover food that had been left there by an earlier expedition, and Maurice was so hungry, he actually broke his fast to eat it. He felt energized and put on a bright blue mantle with gold buttons and a 3-7-meter long red silk scarf. He looked more like a prince than a climber. But when the Sherpas looked at the steep, icy slope above them. They knew it was a death sentence. They begged him to turn back. Maurice refused. He told them that if he didn't come back in 2 weeks, they should assume he was dead. On the 29th of May, 1934, he set off completely alone toward the peak. He was 36 years old. He believed that if he could just reach the top, he would signal the monks below using a small shaving mirror to show them that faith was real. He spent several days trying to cut steps into the ice with his axe, but he was too weak. His last diary entry on May 31st simply said, "Off again, gorgeous day." Maurice Wilson was never seen alive again. A year later, another British expedition led by Eric Shipton found his body lying in the snow. He was lying on his side next to his broken tent, which had been torn to pieces by the wind. He was still wrapped in his sleeping bag, looking like he was just taking a nap. Shipton found Maurice's green diary in his backpack. It told the whole story of a man who tried to beat the mountain with nothing but his beliefs. Maurice didn't die because he wasn't brave. He died because he didn't respect the mountain. He thought his dream was more important than the laws of nature, and Everest proved him wrong.